My name is Celestini Hargrove. I am 42 years old. The morning I found my grandmother Adeline's letter hidden behind a false panel in my father's study, I understood everything. The missing inheritance, the documents I was never shown, the years of silence that felt like love but were really erasure. My father Aldous had spent decades building a story. One where my grandmother Adeline had chosen Isolde. One where I was never meant to have anything at all. What he never accounted for was that my grandmother Adeline had written it all down. Every word, every name, every number. She had sealed it herself, hidden it herself, left it for me, and only me, to find. And that letter had been waiting for me since I was 15 years old. My father thought he had buried it deep enough. He was wrong. But before I take you any further into this, I want you to know something. This story, like every story you'll find here, was written with intention. There is a real human presence behind every word you are about to hear. Someone sat with this, chose every detail, because some stories deserve to be told carefully. This is one of them. So stay with me. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about silence and inheritance, about the things families bury and the women who dig them back up. You won't want to miss what comes next. Before we go further, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this story from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. I always read them. I want to begin with the phone call, because that is where everything started to move again after years of stillness. It was a Tuesday, early October, the kind of morning where the light comes in sideways and everything looks slightly gilded, and slightly wrong. I was in my office in the city, the one I had built myself, the one with my name on the door and my grandmother's single photograph on the desk, when my phone rang. It was Aldous' housekeeper, a woman named Ruth who had worked in that house for longer than I had been alive. Her voice was careful in the way voices become careful when they are carrying weight. They were told to minimize. She said my father had been admitted to the hospital. She said it was his heart. She said it was not immediately life-threatening, but that someone should come. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after she hung up. I had not been inside my father's house in for years. Not since the last dinner, where Aldous had spoken over me for 3 hours straight and then, at the end of the night, handed Isolde a document to sign in front of me without explanation, as if I were furniture, as if my presence required no acknowledgement, no consideration, no apology. I had driven home that night and decided, quietly, that I was done performing closeness I did not feel. But Ruth's call changed the calculus. Not because I was afraid for him. If I am honest, and I promised myself years ago that I would be honest when I finally told the story, I was not afraid for him. What I felt was something closer to obligation. The cold, mechanical kind. The kind that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with the person you were raised to be. So I drove to the Hargrove house. It sits on 3 acres outside the city, behind iron gates that have never once felt welcoming to me. I grew up inside those walls, and I have never, not once, felt that they belonged to me. That house was always Aldous'. It smelled like his authority. It was furnished according to his taste. The garden was shaped according to his instructions. Even the light inside felt like it had been approved by him before it was permitted to enter. I parked in the circular drive and Ruth met me at the door. She was in her 60s, white-haired, with the kind of composure that comes from decades of witnessing things you are paid not to speak about. She told me Aldous was stable. She told me Isolde had already been to the hospital and would return in the evening. She offered me tea. I declined. I told her I would wait in the study. I don't know entirely why I said the study. I had not planned it. But something in me, something that had been patient for a very long time, moved in that direction without permission. Ruth nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. And I walked down the long corridor toward the room at the back of the house, where Aldous had spent most of his waking life. The study smelled exactly as it always had. Old paper, lemon oil, the ghost of a particular pipe tobacco he had given up 20 years ago. But that had saturated the wall so thoroughly it never fully left. The curtains were drawn halfway. The desk was immaculate. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, filled with the kind of books that are purchased for their spines rather than their contents. I stood in the center of the room and breathed. I don't know what made me look at the wall behind the desk. I had been in that room dozens of times over the course of my life, and I had never once looked at it carefully. It was paneled in dark walnut, the same as the rest of the room, fitted with the same trim, the same proportions. There was nothing remarkable about it. There was nothing that announced itself. But that morning, standing alone in my father's house while he lay in a hospital bed across town, I walked behind his desk, something I had never been permitted to do as a child. And I looked at the wall, and I saw it, a seam, barely visible, running vertically through the paneling at a point that didn't quite align with the natural grain of the wood, a seam that should not have been there. My hand moved before my mind gave it permission. The panel shifted inward at the slightest pressure. A small, dark space behind it. Not a full room, barely a cavity. Deep enough for a shelf, wide enough for a box. And on that shelf, inside that box, sealed in an envelope that had yellowed at the edges and bore my full name written in my grandmother Adeline's unmistakable hand, a letter. I knew before I touched it. I knew in the way you know things that your body has been waiting to know for 27 years. My name, her handwriting. The date in the corner, written when I was 15 years old. I had never seen it before in my life. And yet somehow, in the part of me that had always known something was missing, it felt exactly like coming home. I did not open the letter immediately. That is the part people find hardest to believe when I tell the story. They expect me to say I tore it open right there behind my father's desk, hands shaking, breath stolen. And I understand why they expect that. But I have never been a woman who moves from shock directly into action. I move from shock into stillness first. It is how I was built. It is, I would later understand, how my grandmother Adeline was built too. I stood in that study for a long time with the envelope in my hands. I felt the weight of it, and I mean that literally, not poetically. It was heavier than a single sheet of paper should be. There was something else inside. Something rigid. I would learn what it was later. In that moment, I only held it. I let myself feel the fact of it. My name in her handwriting, the date. The yellowed edges that told me this object had been waiting in that dark cavity. For 27 years, patient as stone, certain I would come. I slid it into the inside pocket of my coat. Then I straightened the shelf. I pressed the panel back into place until the seam disappeared. I walked back around my father's desk, adjusted the chair exactly as I had found it, and stood at the center of the room once more. Ruth knocked softly 10 minutes later to say the tea was ready after all, if I had changed my mind. I told her thank you. I told her I needed to step outside for air. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, and I waited until I was certain my hands were steady before I allowed myself to think about what I was holding, to understand what that letter meant, to understand why finding it rearranged every memory I had ever built. You have to understand who Adeline Hargrove was. Not the version of her that Aldous curated after she died, not the softened, selective portrait he presented at her memorial. All gentle words and carefully edited recollections, the real woman. The one I knew. Adeline was born in the early 1930s. The daughter of a seamstress and a man who repaired machinery for factories in the industrial belt of the Midwest. She grew up with very little, and she spoke about that with neither shame nor sentimentality, simply as fact, the way you speak about weather. She was 17 when she left her hometown with $40 and a single leather case. She was 23 when she started the business that would become the foundation of everything the Hargrove name eventually stood on. She never inherited anything. She never married into anything. She built it, fabric by fabric, contract by contract, decade by decade, with the particular ferocity of someone who knows exactly what it feels like to have nothing, and has decided with cold clarity never to feel that way again. By the time I was born, Adeline was already a woman of considerable means. Not ostentatious. Never ostentatious. She wore the same style of dress for 40 years. She drove practical cars. She kept her offices clean and undecorated except for one framed quotation above her desk that I memorized as a child without fully understanding it. What is built quietly cannot be taken loudly. I understand it now. My earliest memories of Adeline are sensory ones. The specific smell of her house, cedar and something floral, not perfume exactly, more like dried flowers pressed between the pages of old books. The weight of her hand on the back of my head, which she placed there sometimes when she was reading, and I was sitting near her. Not as a gesture of affection exactly, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. You are here. I know you are here. The sound of her voice on the telephone, lower than it was in conversation, precise, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who has never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She called me Celestini always. Never cease, the way my father's friends called me, the diminutive I grew to quietly resent. Celestini. All 4 syllables, every time. As if my full name were a thing worth saying completely. I was her eldest grandchild. Isolde came 3 years after me, and Adeline loved her too. I never doubted that. But there was something in the way Adeline looked at me that I could not name as a child and can name very clearly now. Recognition. She looked at me the way you look at someone who carries something of you inside them. Something essential. Something you want to protect. She died when I was 21, quickly. As she had done most things, a diagnosis in the spring, a funeral in the autumn of the same year. She did not make her illness a long production. She managed it the way she managed everything else in her life, with discretion, with control, and with a precision that I only now understand extended far beyond what any of us knew. Because at some point between her diagnosis and her death, Adeline Hargrove sat down and wrote a letter. She wrote it for me. She hid it where only I could find it, and the reason I know it was meant for only me is something the letter itself confirms in her own words in the first paragraph. Something she wrote that stopped my breath when I finally read it. But I am getting ahead of myself. What I need you to understand first is a memory that came back to me as I sat in my car outside my father's house with that envelope pressed against my ribs. I was 15 years old. Adeline had been diagnosed 2 months prior, though she had not told any of us yet. She came to collect me from school one afternoon without warning. No explanation to my father. No notice to anyone. She simply appeared at the gate in her dark green car and told me to get in. I asked where we were going. She said, "There is someone I want you to meet." She drove me to a building downtown I had never been to. A law office, modest exterior, brass nameplate beside the door. She led me inside and introduced me to a woman who was perhaps 40 years old at the time, sharp-eyed, composed, with a kind of stillness that signals not passivity, but complete internal authority. Adeline placed her hand on my shoulder and said to this woman, with a gravity I did not understand at 15, "Remember her name." The woman looked at me directly and said, "I will." I did not know then what that moment meant. I did not know the woman's name would be Cole. I did not know that 27 years later, I would be the one calling her. Tell me in the comments, did you have someone in your life who moved quietly but left something behind for you to find? A message, a gesture, a truth you didn't understand until much later. I want to hear it, because Adeline left me something I wasn't ready for at 15, and I'm not sure I was fully ready at 42 either. I opened the letter in my car. I know I said I waited until my hands were steady, and they were steady enough, but I did not drive away first, did not find some neutral location, did not give myself the distance I perhaps should have. I sat in my father's driveway, 50 feet from the front door of the house, where he had rewritten my history, and I broke the seal. The envelope contained 2 things. The first was the letter itself, 4 pages, handwritten on Adeline's personal stationery. Cream paper, her initials embossed at the top in a deep navy. The handwriting was hers exactly as I remembered it, upright, deliberate. Each letter formed with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. It was not the handwriting of a woman in decline. It was the handwriting of a woman in complete control, setting down a record she intended to last. The second was a single folded document, a photocopy of something official, dense with legal language, bearing a notarial seal I did not immediately recognize. I set it aside and read the letter first. She began without preamble. Celestini, if you are reading this, you found the panel. I always believed you would. You were the only one who ever truly looked at things. I had to stop after those 2 sentences. I pressed my hand flat against the page and breathed through my nose until the pressure behind my eyes receded. Then I continued. What followed, across 4 pages of cream stationery in my grandmother's precise hand, was the most methodical act of love I have ever encountered. Adeline did not write in grief. She did not write in rage, though she had every reason for it. She wrote the way she had conducted her entire life, with clarity, with order, and with the long view of someone who understood that the truth is only useful if it is documented correctly. She began with the facts. In the year before her diagnosis, she had revised her estate plan significantly. The original will, drawn up decades earlier and never meaningfully updated, had divided her assets broadly between Aldous and various charitable interests. But as she aged and watched her son more carefully, she had grown uneasy. She did not write about what specifically had unsettled her. She used the phrase "a pattern of erasure" and did not elaborate, as though she trusted me to understand exactly what she meant without being told. She had engaged Cole, her attorney of nearly 2 decades, to draft a new instrument, a second will, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. This document made specific provisions for me directly, not through my father, not contingent on anything, directly, in my name, transferring a portion of Adeline's estate that she described in the letter with precise figures I will not reproduce here except to say they were significant. The kind of significant that changes the shape of a life. The will had been signed. The will had been witnessed. The will had been filed. And then, at some point between Adeline's death and the reading of her estate, it had disappeared. If you've been here from the beginning of this story, thank you for staying. Subscribe if you haven't yet. What comes next is the part that took my breath away entirely, and I need you with me. For it, she named him, Aldous Reginald Hargrove, her own son. She wrote his full name, all 3 words, with the same steady hand she had used for every other sentence in that letter, and she set down what she believed had happened with a specificity That made it impossible to dismiss as suspicion or grief-distorted perception. The notary who had witnessed the second will was a man named Percival Oakes. Adeline had known him for years, a quiet, meticulous professional who had handled several of her business transactions. She wrote that in the weeks after her death, Percival had contacted Maureen Cole in a state of considerable distress. He had been approached by Aldous. He had been pressured. The exact nature of the pressure, financial, social, the threat of professional consequences, Adeline did not specify because she was writing from anticipation rather than knowledge. But she wrote, if Percival came to Maureen, it is because your father found a way to make the document disappear. It is the only thing that would have brought him to her door. She was right. She had been dead for 21 years, and she was right about exactly what had happened. The photocopy in the envelope. The second item, the one I had set aside, was a partial reproduction of the second will. Not the full document, a portion. Enough to show the date, the notarial seal, the signature lines, and one specific clause. The one bearing my name. The one that had been removed from every version of Adeline's estate that Aldous had presented to anyone. Maureen Cole held the authenticated original. Adeline wrote that clearly. In the third paragraph of the second page, she wrote that Maureen had been instructed to retain a certified copy in a secure location outside the country, a measure Adeline had insisted upon specifically because she did not trust what Aldous might do once she was gone. She wrote, I could not stop him from trying, but I could make certain he did not succeed permanently. She closed the letter with instructions, not emotional ones. Adeline was not a woman who trafficked in emotional instructions. She told me to call Maureen. She gave me a number, one that, she wrote, would remain active for as long as necessary, because Maureen had agreed to maintain it indefinitely. She told me to use a phrase Adeline sent me when Maureen answered, so that Maureen would know immediately why I was calling and could speak freely. She told me the process would take time, but that the documentation was sound. She told me that Percival Oakes, the notary, had given a signed statement to Maureen before his death. She had anticipated even that, had moved to secure his testimony before it could be lost. She told me that the case was, in her assessment and in Maureen's, airtight. And then, in the final paragraph, in the last lines of the last page, my grandmother Adeline Hargrove wrote the sentence that I have returned to every single day since. You were never forgotten, Celestini. You were hidden. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. I sat in my car for a very long time after that. The house behind me was silent. My father was in a hospital across the city. The letter was in my hands. The driveway gravel was pale in the October light. And somewhere in a secure location outside this country, a woman named Maureen Cole was waiting for a phone call that was 27 years overdue. I folded the letter. I placed it back inside the envelope. I started the car. And then I stopped. Because before I could call Maureen, before I could begin any of it, I needed to understand something that the letter had not fully answered. Something that had been living in the back of my mind since the moment I read my sister's name on the second page, in the clause that described what Aldous had redirected and to whom. The question wasn't whether my father had stolen from me. The question was whether Isolde had known. Tell me in the comments, what do you think? Did Isolde know? Because I went back and forth on that question for days before I had the courage to find out. And the answer was not what I expected. People talk about revelations like lightning, sudden, clean, electric. That was not how this felt. This felt like tide. It came in slow and relentless, memory by memory, thought by thought, each small wave of understanding dragging some earlier moment of my life into a different light. I sat in my apartment that night with Adeline's letter spread out on my kitchen table. The photocopy of the second will beside it, my phone face down next to both. I had not called Maureen yet. I had driven home from my father's house in near silence, the letter burning against my chest like a second heartbeat the entire way. Now, in the quiet, the years began to rearrange themselves. I thought about every time Aldous had used the word responsibility in my presence, always in the context of why he needed to handle things, why I was better off focusing on my career, my own life, my little projects. I thought about the way he had spoken about inheritance as something theoretical, abstract, something that would be handled in due time and did not require my attention. I thought about the night of the will reading itself, when I had been 21 and still raw from Adeline's death, sitting at a polished conference table, while Aldous and his attorney went through a series of documents that felt more like a performance than a legal proceeding. There had been a moment, brief, so brief I hadn't trusted it in hindsight, when I thought I saw confusion flicker across Aldous's face as a lawyer read a particular clause. It had vanished almost immediately, smoothed over by that cultivated patriarchal composure he wore like armor. But now, with Adeline's words in front of me, I understood it for what it was. He had been checking his work. He had been making sure the version of reality he had constructed was holding. I wish I could tell you that my first reaction was fury. It would make for a cleaner story. But the truth is my first reaction was something more numb and more dangerous: recognition. A quiet, sinking acknowledgement that this betrayal did not come out of nowhere. That it was not an aberration. That it was the logical conclusion of a pattern I had been living inside my entire life. Have you ever had that? That moment when a single piece of information drops into place and suddenly every slight, every strange omission, every half-remembered conversation aligns with terrifying precision. If you have, you understand the taste in my mouth that night. It tasted metallic, like I had bitten my own tongue. I traced my finger lightly over Adeline's sentence: "You were never forgotten. You were hidden." The letters were slightly indented, the ink dried smooth. I imagined her handwriting it. I imagined her pausing over the word hidden, deciding whether that was the right one. I imagined her eyes narrowing in that way they did when she was being exact. Hidden. Not erased, not destroyed, not discarded. Hidden. Suddenly, I understood why my grief for her had always contained a note I could never identify, a minor key threaded through every memory. It was this. It was the knowledge, buried somewhere in me, even when I couldn't name it. That something about the way she had left this world did not match the woman I knew. She would not have forgotten me. She hadn't. Someone else had interfered. Once I allowed myself to see it, the recontextualized memories flooded in. The first came from childhood. I was 8, standing in the doorway of the study. This same study where I would later find the hidden panel, watching Aldous and Adeline argue in low, vicious voices. I had assumed all these years that they were arguing about business. That was what adults did in that room. But now I could hear the echo of one phrase, clear as if someone had pressed replay inside my skull. "She is my granddaughter, Mother. Not your project." At 8, I had heard project and thought of school assignments, of science fairs, poster boards, things you were proud of displaying. Now, I understood the contempt in it. The way he reduced my relationship with Adeline to something utilitarian, transactional, something he believed she should not be permitted to shape independently of him. Another memory surfaced, 17 years old, returning from visiting colleges out of state, sitting across from Aldous at the long dining table, while he explained, in that calm, absolute tone of his, why it made more sense for him to hold any educational funds in his own name. "I know how this world works, Celestini," he had said. "You don't want to be managing that kind of thing yourself at your age." I had nodded then, half flattered that he was speaking to me like an adult, half intimidated. Tonight, under the kitchen light, I saw the maneuver for what it was: consolidation. Practice for something larger. I thought about Isolde. How many times had he framed me as the independent one, the one who didn't need as much, while positioning Isolde as the more traditional daughter, the one who would stay closer, who would perhaps one day move into the house, keep things as they were. He had said it with affection, or what passed for affection with him. At the time, it had felt like preference. Now, I recognized the outline of something else. He had been building a narrative. In his narrative, it would make sense that the bulk of the estate went to Isolde. Of course it would. She was the one who stayed. She was the one who played the role he had written for her. I, in his story, was something like a satellite, bright, distant, unnecessary to the central orbit. Narratives like that are powerful. People believe them, especially when they are repeated over years, backed by money and legal documents and the sheer force of a patriarch's certainty. But Adeline had written a different story, and she had put it in my hands. Before I could act, though, there was a question I couldn't release. Did Isolde know? I tried to replay that night for years earlier, when I had last sat at my father's table. The way she had signed the document he slid toward her, the way she had looked at me across the candles, her expression almost apologetic as her pen moved across the page. At the time, I had read guilt there and pulled back from it, too tired to interrogate what it meant. Now, I wasn't sure if it had been guilt at all, or something closer to unease, the kind you feel when you're being used in a way you can't quite see. I thought about calling her. I even picked up my phone at one point, thumb hovering over her name, imagining the conversation. Imagining asking her outright, "Did you know about the second will? Did you know what was taken from me from us?" But the words felt wrong in my mouth. They tasted like accusation, and I wasn't ready to aim that at her. Not yet. Not without more. So instead, I opened a blank page in my notebook and began to write. I wrote down every name from Adeline's letter: Morencole, Percival Oaks, the witnesses she mentioned, the institution where the secure copy had been placed. I wrote down every date. I wrote down the sequence of events as she had described them, in meticulous order, as if I were preparing a case file rather than cataloging a personal betrayal. Because somewhere between reading "You Were Never Forgotten" and looking at my own face, reflected in the dark kitchen window. Something inside me had shifted. Grief had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. Something colder, cleaner. A decision. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, letter in hand, proof of forgery, a father in the hospital, a sister whose role you didn't fully understand, what would your first move be? Call a lawyer? Confront your family? Do nothing? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how many of you would choose the path I did, because it was not the loud one. In the end, my first move was not to confront anyone. My first move was to make coffee. It sounds small, maybe even ridiculous, but I remember the exact way the machine hummed to life. The smell filling my apartment, the way the steam curled in the air. I needed something ordinary in the room with me, some proof that the world still contained simple, controllable processes, that not everything was as treacherous as the paper on my kitchen table. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, a chipped white one Autoline had kept in her office and left to me without ceremony, and sat down. I turned my phone face up. I did not look at my father's contact. I did not look at Isol's. I scrolled instead to the number Autoline had written in the letter. There is a particular stillness right before you change your life on purpose. That is what I felt as my thumb hovered over the call button. I was not acting out of impulse. I was not acting out of a sudden rush of heat. I was acting out of alignment, the feeling of stepping, finally, into the version of myself that had been waiting for me all along. I pressed call. The line rang twice. Before I tell you what happened when she answered, I want to say this: if this story is speaking to you, if you feel yourself in the quiet parts of it, the parts where you make coffee instead of screaming, subscribe. There are more stories here for people like us, who choose strategy over spectacle. The third ring barely started before the line clicked. Cole. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. From that day when I was 15, low, controlled as if every word had passed through 3 filters before being allowed into the air. For a moment, my mind split in two. Half of me was a 42-year-old woman with documents in front of her. The other half was a teenager standing in that modest office, while Autoline's hand rested on her shoulder. I swallowed. Autoline sent me, I said. Silence. Not the kind that means someone has not heard you. The kind that means every part of them is now fully present. When she spoke again, the change in her tone was almost imperceptible. A shift from general to specific, from public to private. State your full name, she said. Celestine Marie Hargrove. Another breath of silence, and then, you found the letter. It was not a question. Yes, I said. Where are you? I gave her the name of my city. And where are you physically, at this moment? She asked. Home, work. Your father's property? My apartment, I said. Is anyone with you? No. There was a sound like papers being moved, or perhaps a drawer opening. When she spoke again, her words were precise, measured, as if she had rehearsed them many times in her mind without ever saying them aloud. Your grandmother asked me, 27 years ago, to prepare for this day. I did not know when you would call. I did not know if you would call. But I am pleased that you have. I exhaled, not realizing until that moment how tightly I had been holding my breath. Before I continue, I want to know something from you. Have you ever met someone who seemed to have been waiting for you without your knowledge? Someone whose entire demeanor told you that your arrival was not an interruption, but the fulfillment of a plan? If you have, tell me in the comments what that felt like. For me, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear, it felt like a door clicking open inside my chest. I have your file, Maren said. The phrase startled me. My file? I repeated. Your grandmother was thorough, she said. She did not simply write a will and hope for the best. She built a structure. That structure includes documentation, sworn statements, copies of relevant instruments, and a clear record of the sequence of events following the execution of her last testamentary document. It also includes notes on your father's behavior before and after her death. There was the sound of another drawer, and a photograph of you at 12 for identification purposes only, she added, almost dryly. I let out a short, incredulous breath that was nearly a laugh. Of course, I murmured. I am going to ask you some questions, Maren said. I need to confirm that nothing material has changed in your circumstances that would affect how we proceed. Then I will tell you what I have, and what your options are. Is that acceptable? Yes, I said. It's more than acceptable. She asked about my current occupation, my financial independence, whether I had ever signed any documents presented by Aldous relating to Autoline's estate, or any trust accounts he might have claimed were set up for my benefit. She asked whether I had ever received statements for any such accounts, whether any assets had been transferred to me in the years following Autoline's death, under the guise of gifts or adjustments. Her questions were forensic without being invasive, clinical without being cold. I realized halfway through that she was not just gathering information. She was also assessing me. Not whether I deserved what had been taken. That was never in question for her, I could tell. But whether I had the temperament to walk the path Autoline had set. The quiet path. The legal one. The one with no dramatic confrontation, no shouting matches in hospital rooms, no theatrical revelations of family dinners. When she finished, there was a brief pause. "Very well," Maren said. "Here's what you need to know." She told me that after Autoline executed the second will, the one naming me directly, with the allocations clearly indicated, she had immediately instructed Maren to create certified copies. One copy was lodged with a firm in another country, under conditions that ensured it could not be altered or accessed without dual authorization. Another copy remained with Maren in a secure archive. The original had been held locally, until Aldous, as Autoline had predicted, intervened after her death. He had presented a different will, an earlier version. He had claimed it was the only one. When Maren had raised questions, gently at first, then with increasing insistence, he had pressured the notary, Percival Oakes, to support his version of events. Percival, under that pressure, had faltered. He had gone to Maren privately, admitted that he had witnessed a later will, that he had been asked to remain silent. Maren, anticipating that his courage might not last forever under sustained pressure, had immediately taken his sworn statement. "He is deceased now," she said. "But his statement is not, nor is my record of our meetings, nor are the documents held abroad." Her voice did not harden. It did not need to. The facts were hard enough. "So what does that mean?" I asked quietly. "It means," she said, "that if you instruct me to proceed, we can challenge the administration of your grandmother's estate. It will not be loud. It will not be public unless your father chooses to make it so. But it will be effective. Your grandmother ensured that." I stared at the letter on my table. I thought of Aldous in his hospital bed. I thought of Isolde, sitting in her house with a version of our family story that was about to be fractured. And I thought of Autoline, writing those lines in careful ink, knowing this conversation would one day take place without her. "I want to proceed," I said. "If you were in my place, would you have said the same? Or would you have walked away rather than reopen everything? Tell me in the comments. I know some of you would choose peace over justice, and some of you know. They are not opposites at all." The call with Maren lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes. When it ended, I felt a clarity I had not experienced in years. Not relief, that would come later if it came at all. Clarity. The kind that comes when you finally see the full shape of the machinery that has been running your life without your permission. She told me she would begin the process immediately. She told me to expect a formal engagement letter by morning, along with instructions for the next steps. She told me to make no contact with Aldous or Isolde until she had assessed the risk of any statements being used against me. She said the words preservation of evidence with the same uninflected precision she had used throughout our conversation. I hung up. I poured more coffee, though it had gone cold. I sat at the table and looked at Autoline's letter again, tracing the indentations of her handwriting with my fingertip. That is when the second question returned, sharper than before. What about Isolde? I had avoided it during the call, but Maren had mentioned her name once, briefly. In the context of the estate distribution Aldous had engineered, Isolde had received the family home, the bulk of the liquid assets, certain business interests Autoline had built. Maren had not editorialized. She had simply stated the facts. But now, alone in my apartment, the question was insistent. Had Isolde known? Had she signed documents with full awareness of what they took from me? Or had she been positioned like furniture, like the documents themselves, to complete a picture she did not fully understand? I needed to know. I called her the next morning. Not from my apartment, not from my office. I drove to a park on the edge of the city. The kind with gravel paths and benches facing a small artificial lake. The kind where no one overhears conversations unless they are trying to. It was early, the lights still thin, the benches empty. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was cautious, the way it always was when I called without warning. "Celestini?" she said. "Everything all right?" "I went to the house yesterday," I said, without preamble. "After Ruth called about father." A pause. "Yes, she mentioned that." "Did you?" "I found something," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Found what?" she asked. I did not tell her about the letter. Not directly. Instead, I told her about the panel, about the cavity behind it, about the envelope with my name on it. I told her about Autoline's handwriting, the date, the weight of the paper. I did not read her the contents. I told her only that there was a second will. That had named me. That had contradicted everything we had been told. She was silent for a very long time. When she spoke, her voice was small. "I didn't know," she said. "Celestini. I swear I didn't know." I believed her. Not because she sounded convincing, though she did in the fractured way of someone who is suddenly seeing their own life through a different lens. I believed her because of the way she said my full name, the way Autoline had always said it. Celestini. Not C's, not C. The full weight of it, as if she were acknowledging me properly for the first time. She told me what she knew, which was less than I had feared and more than I had hoped. Aldous had come to her shortly after Autoline's death. He had presented documents, clean, notarized, official-looking, and explained that their grandmother had made changes in her final months. Changes that favored Isolde because she was the one who had stayed close, the one who understood the family businesses, the one who would preserve things as Autoline wanted. He had framed it as a gesture of trust, of continuity. Isolde had been 20, grieving, overwhelmed. She had signed. She had not asked for copies. She had not questioned the notary's involvement. She had trusted him because he was her father, because he had always been the one who handled these things, because questioning him had never occurred to her. He said you were taken care of separately, she said. Her voice broke on the last word. He said Autoline had set up something for you that didn't need to go through the main reading. A trust, something private. He said that's why your name wasn't in the documents he showed me. I closed my eyes. The gravel beneath my feet crunched slightly as I shifted position. There was no trust, I said quietly. She inhaled sharply. I should have known, she whispered. God, Celestini. I should have known. The complexity of that conversation is what I want you to understand. And it was not simple forgiveness, though I did forgive her. It was not simple anger, though there was anger not at her, but at the machinery that had positioned us against each other without either of us seeing it. Aldous had not stolen from just me. He had rewritten the story for both of us. For Isolde, he had created a narrative of special selection, of being the chosen one. For me, he had created a narrative of independence, of not needing. Both stories were lies designed to keep us separate, compliant, and grateful. We talked for nearly an hour. She cried. I did not, though my throat ached with the effort. She asked if there was anything she could do. I told her the truth. Stay silent. Let Morin work. Do not speak to father about this. Not yet. What happens when he finds out? She asked. He finds out soon, I said. But not from us. When we hung up, I sat on that bench for another 30 minutes, watching the water ripple under the weak morning sun. I had gone into that call fearing a final fracture between us. What I found instead was the beginning of something else. A recognition that we had both been manipulated. Both been positioned as pieces in a game neither of us had agreed to play. The moral complexity settled over me then, heavy but not paralyzing. Aldous had not just forged documents. He had forged an entire family dynamic. He had taught us to see each other as competitors rather than allies. He had done it so thoroughly that for decades, we had lived inside his fiction without questioning it. But Autoline had seen it coming. She had built her protections accordingly, not just for me, but for the truth itself. And now, with Marin's machinery beginning to turn, with Isolde's voice still echoing in my ear, I understood something new about revenge. It was not about making him suffer. It was about making the truth visible, quietly, irrevocably, permanently. Marin moved quickly. The engagement letter arrived the next morning, delivered by courier to my apartment door. 7 pages, single-spaced, outlining the scope of representation, the applicable statutes, the timeline for filing, the preservation of privilege. I signed it electronically by noon. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, she had confirmed retrieval of the documents held abroad. The certified copy of Autoline's second will, Percival Oakes' sworn statement, the chain of custody records that made the entire package unassailable. She called me that evening. The materials are en route, she said. They will arrive in my office tomorrow. I have already engaged forensic document experts to examine the photocopy you found against the original, and I have begun the process of petitioning the court to reopen the probate of your grandmother's estate. On what grounds? I asked. Fraud. She said simply, undue influence, suppression of a later will. There are 3 independent causes of action, each with its own body of precedent. Your grandmother's instructions anticipated all of it. I pictured Autoline at her desk writing that letter, knowing her son well enough to foresee not just the forgery but the legal countermeasures needed to undo it. What happens next? I asked. Your father receives notice, Morin said. Formal service. He will be informed that the estate administration is being challenged, that certain distributions are subject to clawback, that he has a period of time to respond. It will arrive at his residence, or his attorney's office if he has retained one. Given his current condition, it may be routed through hospital administration. No confrontation? I asked. Not unless he chooses it, she said. This is civil procedure, Celestini. It is designed for exactly this kind of resolution. Quiet, documented, final. The documents arrived at Aldous' house 3 days later. I know because Isolde called me that evening. Her voice was taut, almost breathless. It came, she said. A courier. Thick envelope. Father's name on it. Ruth signed for it. She brought it to him in his study, the same study, and she trailed off. What? I asked. He didn't open it immediately, she said. He sat with it on his desk for 20 minutes, just looking at it. Then he called his attorney. I closed my eyes, picturing it. The walnut panel still in place behind him, seamless. The letter long gone. The weight of what he had buried now sitting in front of him, heavier than he had ever imagined. Did he say anything to you? I asked. Not directly, she said. But he looked at me differently after that, like he was recalculating something. And Ruth, she told me he hasn't slept well since he came home from the hospital. I did not ask what that meant. I did not need to. Sleep is the first thing to go when the machinery you built begins to turn against you. Morin confirmed the details the next day. Aldous had been served properly. He had retained counsel, the same firm that had handled Autoline's original probate. They had requested an extension to respond, citing his medical condition. Morin had granted it, but only briefly. They are reviewing the documents we provided in the notice, she said. The full packet, photocopies of the second will, Oak's statement, the foreign custody records. They will see immediately that this is not a bluff. And the assets? I asked. We have begun the valuation process, she said. The family home, the business interests, the investment accounts, everything that was improperly distributed will be subject to recovery. Some of it goes to you directly, per the second will. Some of it returns to the estate for redistribution according to Autoline's true intentions. She paused. Including provisions for your sister, she added. Your grandmother was fair, even in her protections. I thought of Isolde, sitting across from me at that dinner 4 years ago, signing documents she had believed were legitimate. I felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of architecture working as designed. The revaluation took 2 weeks. Morin sent updates by email. Dry, factual, relentless. The house appraised at a figure that made me blink. The business holdings had appreciated significantly under management that was not Aldous's. The accounts he had controlled contained discrepancies that her forensic accountants were documenting methodically. Aldous's attorneys proposed settlement twice. The first offer was insultingly low. The second acknowledged the second will's validity but attempted to negotiate the clawback. Percentages Morin declined both without countering. She was following Autoline's instructions. Full recovery, no compromise. Isolde and I spoke twice during that period. She was navigating her own recalibration, anger at Aldous, grief for the version of their relationship she had believed in, uncertainty about what came next for her. I listened more than I spoke. We did not discuss the money. We discussed instead the shape of the family we might build without his narrative holding it together. One evening, Morin called with final confirmation. The court has issued the order, she said. The estate is reopened. Distributions reversed. Assets retitled. Your father retains a portion, enough to live on, per the original structure Autoline intended before his interference. But the bulk returns, where it belongs. To me? I asked. To you, she said. And to the estate, for your sister and the charitable interests your grandmother specified. Percival Oakes' statement was the linchpin. He named the pressure tactics directly. There is no defense. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights. What happens to him now? I asked. Legally, Morin said. Nothing criminal, unless you choose to pursue it civilly. He loses the empire he built on forgery. Personally, that is between him and his conscience. There was a faint smile in her voice on the last word. That was my revenge. Silent. Legal. Elegant. No courtroom theatrics. No family explosions. No public shaming. Just documents served properly. Truth documented meticulously. Justice delivered by mail. Aldous Hargrove received his inheritance back, the one he had stolen, in the form of a court order telling him exactly what he had lost. And somewhere, I like to imagine Autoline watching, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, nodding once in approval. It has been 18 months since the court order. Aldous is alive. He lives in a smaller house now, not the family mansion, which was retitled and sold as part of the estate redistribution. He sold it quietly, without fanfare. The proceeds were divided according to Autoline's specifications, a portion to me, a portion to Isolde, the balance to the charitable foundations my grandmother had quietly supported for decades. He and I have not spoken since the day I found the letter. Not a single word. There have been no grand confrontations, no tearful apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. He knows what I know. The documents speak for themselves. Sometimes silence is a most articulate response. Isolde and I see each other regularly now. We meet for coffee in neutral places, away from the old house, away from memories that no longer fit the women we have become. She sold her share of the business interests and started something new, something of her own. She speaks about it with a lightness I recognize from Autoline, the lightness of someone who has shed a weight they did not fully understand they were carrying. We do not dwell on what Aldous did. We discuss, instead, what we are building. What comes next? Maren Cole and I met once in person after the final distributions were complete. She invited me to her office, the same modest building where Autoline had brought me at 15. It had not changed much. The brass nameplate was the same. The quotation on the wall had been joined by another, smaller one, "Truth endures." We sat across from each other at her desk. She poured tea from a pot that smelled of cedar and dried flowers. She handed me a final folder, Autoline's complete file. Declassified now that the matter was resolved. Inside were letters I had never seen, notes from Autoline to Maren over the years. Meticulous instructions written in that same precise hand, anticipating every contingency. "She loved you," Maren said simply, watching me turn the pages. Not in the sentimental way. In the practical way. The way that lasts. I nodded, unable to speak. Before I left, she told me one last thing. Autoline had visited her office one final time, just days before her death. She had brought a photograph, the one from my file, me at 12, and asked Maren to remember my face. "She said you would come," Maren told me. "She said it might take years, but you would come." I did. This morning, I sit in the chair that was Autoline's. I had it restored after the settlement, the leather repaired, the wood refinished, but the shape exactly the same. It sits in my office now, positioned by the window where the light comes in sideways. I run my hand over the armrest and feel the faint impressions of her fingers, preserved through decades. I think about the panel in Aldous's study, seamless now that I removed what was behind it. I think about the envelope, yellowed but intact, preserved in a safe place. I think about the documents that traveled across borders, waited patiently, and returned to rewrite everything. I think about the woman who built an empire quietly, foresaw its perversion, and built protections even quieter. And I think about the daughters she raised, the sons she could not fully protect, and the way his need for control erased not just money, but trust and time, and the simple truth of what family could have been. There is one last thing I want to tell you. In the very bottom of Autoline's file, tucked between the final pages of legal correspondence, was a single additional sheet of her stationery, not part of the letter I found. Something separate, something she must have given Maren separately, with instructions to deliver only after resolution. It contained one sentence, written in her hand. "Celestini, now build something that cannot be taken." I keep it on my desk, next to her photograph. Every day, I look at it. Every day, I begin. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If it moves something in you, a memory, a question, a decision, share it in the comments below. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, subscribe. There are more waiting, stories about the quiet architectures we build, and the ones we inherit. This was Celestini Hargrove. Until next time.